Hello everyone and welcome. I am the Congressman and this is Every Member of Congress Ever, a series in which I am going to introduce you to literally every person who has ever been a part of the United States Congress. March 4th, 1789, the very first day of the very first Congress. Now, there were only 11 states at the time, since North Carolina and Rhode Island hadn't ratified the Constitution yet, so 22 senators. However, New York's state legislature was a hot mess and hadn't elected senators yet, so we'll start with 20. However, on March 4th, 1789, the very first day of the very first Congress at Federal Hall in New York City, only 8 had shown up on time. So we'll start with them. John Langdon was a 47-year-old merchant from Portsmouth, New Hampshire, who had been a delegate to the Continental Congress and served 2 terms as president of New Hampshire, basically the pre-Constitution version of governor. He also presided over the Constitutional Convention in 1787, so when it came time for New Hampshire's new state legislature to elect its first 2 senators, Langdon was a natural choice. The other New Hampshire senator was Payne Wingate, a 49-year-old former pastor-turned-farmer from Stratham, New Hampshire. He had served in New Hampshire's State House of Representatives and also in the Continental Congress. Caleb Strong was a 44-year-old lawyer from Northampton, Massachusetts. He was a former district attorney who had served in both houses of the Massachusetts State Legislature and also in the Continental Congress. He was a delegate to the Constitutional Convention in 1787, but he had to leave early when his wife got sick, so he didn't sign the Constitution. But he did support it when it came time for Massachusetts to ratify it. William S. Johnson was a lawyer from Stratford, Connecticut. At 61 years old, he was the oldest member of the First Senate. Not the first Congress, though. That would be Representative Roger Sherman, also of Connecticut. Johnson had been a delegate to the Continental Congress, served on the Connecticut Council of Assistants, and attended the Constitutional Convention in 1787. They sure loved alliteration with the letter C. The other Connecticut senator was Oliver Ellsworth, a 43-year-old lawyer from Windsor, Connecticut. He was a district attorney for Hartford County and served in the Continental Congress. He was also a judge on the Connecticut Superior Court and, like William S. Johnson, a member of the Connecticut Council of Assistants. Basically a multi-man version of what would eventually become like governor and lieutenant governor. Robert Morris was a 55-year-old merchant who was originally from Liverpool, England, and was raised by his grandmother when his father left for the colonies. At the age of 13, Morris was sent to join him in Oxford, Maryland, but 2 years later his father sent him to live with a family friend in Philadelphia. It was this family friend that introduced Morris to the businesses of banking and shipping. Between his business acumen and his father dying from an infected wound and leaving him a large inheritance, Morris was quite successful. He served in the Continental Congress and in the Pennsylvania House of Representatives. He was also a signer of both the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. William Maclay was a 51-year-old lawyer from New Garden, Pennsylvania, who had served in both the French and Indian War and in the Revolutionary War. He had been clerk of courts for Northumberland County, a judge on the Court of Common Pleas, and a member of the Pennsylvania General Assembly. During his time in Congress, Maclay also kept a journal, which still survives today and is one of the few first-hand sources of information we have on the day-to-day operations of the Senate during the first Congress. William Few was a 40-year-old farmer turned lawyer turned militia commander who was originally from Baltimore, Maryland, and grew up in Orange County, North Carolina. After some troubles involving something called the Regulator Movement, it's a long story, I'll tell you another time, Few and his family ended up in Georgia, where he was finally able to open up his law practice. But then the Revolutionary War started, so Few became a militiaman instead. After the war, he served in the Georgia House of Representatives and the Continental Congress. And that was the original 8. 2 weeks later, on March 19th, William Patterson of New Jersey arrived. Patterson was a 43-year-old lawyer who had originally been born in Ireland. His family moved to Pennsylvania when he was 2 and eventually settled in New Jersey. He was a member of New Jersey's Provincial Congress before becoming the state's Attorney General in 1776, and he was also a member of the Continental Congress. 2 days later, on March 21st, Richard Bassett of Delaware arrived. Bassett was a 43-year-old lawyer from Dover, Delaware. He had been a part of the Continental Army during the Revolutionary War and had also been a member of the Delaware Legislative Council, the Delaware House of Representatives, and the Delaware State Senate. He was also a signer of the Constitution in 1787. Another week went by, and on March 28th, Jonathan Elmer of New Jersey arrived. Elmer was a 43-year-old physician from Cedarville, New Jersey. He was a member of the first class of medical students at the University of Pennsylvania, and after graduating, he set up practice in Bridgeton, New Jersey. He was the High Sheriff of Cumberland County in 1772, and then served in both the Continental Congress and the New Jersey Legislative Council. He became a trustee of the College of New Jersey, now known as Princeton, in 1782, and held that position during and after his time in Congress. So now here we are, it's the end of March, it's been almost a whole month, and keep in mind the Senate couldn't do anything until they had a quorum, meaning a majority of members present. So even with those last 3 late arrivals, they were still 1 short. So all they could do was keep showing up and adjourning until the next day. Twice they sent "Where are you?" letters to the missing senators. Finally, on April 6th, Richard Henry Lee of Virginia arrived, making 12 members present and giving them the quorum they needed. And you know, it's actually kind of appropriate that it would be Lee, because he was one of the most historically significant figures of the Revolutionary era. Lee was a 57-year-old politician from Stratford, Virginia, whose father, Virginia Governor Thomas Lee, trained him right from the start for a career in politics. As a teenager, Lee was sent to Wakefield, England, to be formally educated at Queen Elizabeth Grammar School, which is actually still in operation today. After returning to Virginia, Lee served as Justice of the Peace for Westmoreland County and was elected to the Virginia House of Burgesses, the pre-independence version of a House of Representatives. He was then elected to the Continental Congress, including a year as president, and served in the Virginia House of Delegates. He was also a signer of the Declaration of Independence, which brings us to why I said he's one of the most significant figures of that era. It's something you might remember about him from your high school history class, the Lee Resolution. At the Second Continental Congress, on June 7, 1776, Richard Henry Lee put forward the following motion. Resolved, that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved. The motion was seconded by Massachusetts delegate John Adams, and the Lee Resolution was formally passed July 2nd, 1776. All that was left to do now was to write up a final draft and sign it, which they did 2 days later. But for most of the delegates in attendance, July 2nd was the day the colonies truly declared their independence. John Adams famously wrote home to his wife Abigail the next day. The 2nd day of July, 1776, will be the most memorable epoch in the history of America. I am apt to believe that it will be celebrated by succeeding generations as the great anniversary festival. It ought to be commemorated as the day of deliverance by solemn acts of devotion to God Almighty. It ought to be solemnized with pomp and parade, with shows, games, sports, guns, bells, bonfires, and illuminations, from one end of this continent to the other, from this time forward forevermore. Adams was right about the Independence Day celebrations, just not the Independence Day itself. July 4th was the day they all signed the final draft, so July 4th became Independence Day. And it was Richard Henry Lee whose resolution had gotten the ball rolling in that direction a month earlier. So like I said, it's fitting that Lee's arrival at Federal Hall would be the one to finally give the new Senate the quorum it needed. And with that quorum achieved at last, they could finally get down to business. They elected John Langdon president pro tempore, meaning he presided over the Senate until the vice president could be inaugurated. And together with the House, who had also been waiting a month for a quorum and had only just gotten it a few days earlier, they officially counted the electoral votes for president and vice president. A week later, on April 13th, 3 new senators arrived. First, Ralph Izard was a 47 or 48-year-old politician from Charleston, South Carolina, but he spent most of his younger years in Europe. He went to school in England and then moved to France in 1776 when the Continental Congress appointed him commissioner to the court of Tuscany. He was recalled from that post in 1779, and after returning to South Carolina, he served in the Continental Congress. Second, Charles Carroll was a 51-year-old planter and lawyer from Annapolis, Maryland. He had attended Jesuit schools, first in Maryland and then in France. He studied law in England before returning to the colonies in 1765. After the war, he was a member of the Continental Congress and served in the Maryland State Senate. He actually continued to hold that latter office during and after his time in the United States Senate. The third new arrival was George Reed, a 55-year-old lawyer from Newcastle, Delaware. He had been a member of the Continental Congress and then the Delaware Legislative Council, where he spent 1 year as the president of Delaware when the previous president was captured by the British after the Battle of Brandywine. That previous president was a guy called John McKinley, and he was later paroled in a prisoner exchange in 1778. Fun fact, the prisoner he was exchanged for was William Franklin, the loyalist son of Benjamin Franklin. The more you know. Anyway, Reed had also attended the Constitutional Convention of 1787, and he's one of the surprisingly small number of people who signed both the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. The next day, April 14th, Tristram Dalton arrived. Dalton was a 50-year-old merchant from Newburyport, Massachusetts. He had actually studied law at Harvard, where he was a classmate of John Adams, but chose to pursue a career in business instead. Later, he served in the pre-independence Massachusetts Provincial Congress and in the post-independence Massachusetts State Legislature, where he was Speaker of the House in 1784. A week later, on April 20th, two more senators arrived. John Henry of Maryland, who was a 38-year-old lawyer from Dorchester County. He had studied law at the College of New Jersey, now known as Princeton, and also at the Middle Temple in London. He was a member of the Maryland House of Delegates, the Continental Congress, and then the Maryland State Senate. The other new arrival was James Gunn, a 36-year-old Virginia native who had served in the Revolutionary War and then settled in Georgia, where he became a planter and militia commander. His career before Congress is less about being a public servant and more about being a public nuisance. He wrote a series of newspaper articles attacking Revolutionary War generals and fellow Georgians James Jackson and Anthony Wayne, and according to historian Stephen E. Seary, he even challenged General Nathaniel Greene to a duel. The challenge was not accepted. Also, James Jackson had been elected to the House of Representatives, which of course met in the same federal hall in New York City. So I like to think that every morning, as they arrived to work, they met in the hallway and just stared daggers at each other before going off in their own directions. On April 21st, the House and Senate together formally inaugurated Vice President John Adams, and on April 30th did the same for President George Washington. Another entire month went by before William Grayson of Virginia arrived on May 21st. You can almost imagine the conversation. Hey, sorry I'm late. What did I miss? Not much. We set up some committees, established some, rules and procedures, and, inaugurated a goddamn president. Anyway, William Grayson was a 46 or 47-year-old lawyer from Prince William County, Virginia. He was a lieutenant colonel in the Revolutionary War and was even George Washington's aide-de-camp for a while. He suffered through the infamous winter at Valley Forge. After the war, he served in the Virginia House of Delegates and then the Continental Congress. The Senate was now 3 months into a 7-month session, and they were still missing one guy. Pierce Butler of South Carolina finally arrived on June 8th. Butler was a 44-year-old Irish-born plantation owner who was actually a member of the British Army until 1773, when he resigned his commission and settled in South Carolina. He quickly got involved in local politics, serving in the South Carolina House of Representatives until being assigned to the post of Adjutant General, basically an administrative position coordinating the state's military actions. And he wasn't very good at it. His operation to drive the British out of Savannah failed, and he was nearly captured when he failed to prevent the British from taking Charleston. After the war, with his plantation and his business interests in shambles, he went to London to try to regrow his wealth. He returned to South Carolina in 1785 and was elected to the Continental Congress and then sent to the Constitutional Convention in 1787, where his many terrible ideas could fill an entire video of their own. In July, New York's state legislature finally got its shit together and elected a couple senators. The first to arrive was Rufus King on July 25th. He was only 34, which makes him the youngest of this original group of senators, although his record would only stand for about a year and a half before James Monroe arrived for the third session, but we'll get there. King was a lawyer from Scarborough, Massachusetts, the district that would later become Maine. He served in the militia during the Revolutionary War, and afterwards set up a law practice in Newburyport, Massachusetts. He was a member of the Massachusetts State Legislature and a delegate from Massachusetts to both the Continental Congress and the Constitutional Convention in 1787. So how did a prominent Massachusetts politician become one of New York's first two senators? Well, it's simple. He had developed such a taste for politics that in 1788 he ditched his law practice entirely and moved to New York City. Almost immediately he was elected to the New York House of Representatives, but he was only there briefly before being elected to the new United States Senate. The other New York senator was 55-year-old career military man Philip Schuyler, who arrived July 27th. His father had been the mayor of Albany, his grandfather had been the mayor of New York City, but you probably know him better as the father-in-law of Alexander Hamilton. Schuyler was also a delegate to the Continental Congress and a member of the New York State Senate. In 1781, he was the victim of an attempted kidnapping plot, which is a super interesting story that definitely deserves its own video, but suffice it to say he escaped unharmed. The attempted kidnappers did make off with 2 of his servants and a bunch of his silver plates, though. The servants were later released. The fate of the silver plates remains unknown. The first session ended September 29th, 1789. It had been 7 months long, but they had to wait 1 full month before they could do anything, and it was another 2 full months before they were fully intact. Not the best start. Maybe the next session will be better. The start date for that next session was set, Monday, January 4th, 1790. In the interim, North Carolina ratified the Constitution and elected its senators. So, Monday, January 4th, 1790, there would be 24 senators. And only 10 showed up on time. So you know what that means. No quorum! This time, though, at least, the wait for a quorum wasn't long. John Henry arrived the next day, and William Maclay arrived on the 6th, giving them the quorum they needed after just 2 days of waiting. Significant improvement. Almost everyone else arrived at Federal Hall over the next couple weeks, including the 2 newcomers from North Carolina. The first was Benjamin Hawkins, who arrived January 13th. Hawkins was a 35-year-old military man from Granville County, North Carolina. During the early years of the Revolutionary War, he was a part of George Washington's staff, serving as his French interpreter. He was later replaced by the Marquis de Lafayette. From there, Hawkins was a member of the North Carolina House of Representatives and the Continental Congress. The other North Carolina senator was Samuel Johnston, who arrived January 29th. Johnston was a 56-year-old planter and lawyer from Edenton, North Carolina. He was originally born in Scotland, but his family immigrated to North Carolina when Johnston was 3 years old. Before the war, he served in the North Carolina House of Burgesses. After the war, he was a member of North Carolina's state legislature, then the Continental Congress, and then he was governor of North Carolina. But let's go back to the before the war part. If you recall, a little while ago I was talking about William Few and how he and his family got caught up in something called the Regulator Movement in North Carolina. Well, Few and his family were on the insurrection side of the whole thing. Samuel Johnston was a legislator on the government side. In fact, the bill that was passed in response to all of that was called the Johnston Riot Act. James Few, William's brother, had even been executed by hanging in 1771 for his part in the whole thing. So this had to be a little awkward for the two of them working together now. You know, I thought James Jackson and James Gunn would stare daggers at each other. I can only imagine what it was like for these two. At least Jackson and Gunn went to separate chambers. These two were both in the Senate and had to work together all day, every day. So anyway, almost everyone had made it back by the end of the first month. There were some holdouts, though. George Reed and Charles Carroll didn't show up until March. Richard Henry Lee and James Gunn didn't show up until April. And William Grayson of Virginia didn't show up at all. Of course, he was dead, so I guess that's a valid excuse. His replacement in the Senate was John Walker, a 46-year-old planter and lawyer from Albemarle County, Virginia. He had served as a colonel in the Revolutionary War and had also been a member of the Continental Congress. But he was only a temporary senator. In most of the states in these early days, if a senator died or resigned while the state legislature was not in session, the governor would temporarily appoint someone to serve until the next time the legislature convened and could elect the next real senator. On May 29, 1790, Rhode Island finally ratified the Constitution, becoming the 13th state. Its 2 senators both arrived on June 25th. First up, Theodore Foster, who was a 38-year-old lawyer from Providence. He was originally from Massachusetts, but after graduating from the college in the English colony of Rhode Island and Providence Plantations, known today by its much shorter name, Brown, he decided to stay in Rhode Island to practice law. He served briefly in Rhode Island's State House of Representatives, and he was the town clerk of Providence. The other Rhode Island senator was Joseph Stanton, Jr., a 50-year-old military man from Charlestown, Rhode Island. His only public office was the Rhode Island General Assembly, of which he was a member in the years preceding the Revolutionary War. After the war, he was a militia commander all the way up to 1790 when he was sent as a delegate to Rhode Island's State Constitutional Convention. During the Senate's second session, say that 5 times fast, it was officially decided that a new federal district would be created and that the government would operate there starting in 1800. It was also decided that until then, the government would move from New York to Philadelphia. The starting date for the third session was set, Monday, December 6, 1790 in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Do you know what I'm going to say next? If you said there was no quorum again, then you are wrong. They still didn't have all 26 senators present. That would be crazy. But they did have 15, which was enough for a quorum and no waiting around this time. Also, let's give some credit to John Langdon, Payne Wingate, and William Few, who were the only 3 senators to show up on time to all 3 sessions. Kudos, guys. There were also 2 brand new senators who were both there right away on December 6th. First up, James Monroe, who was a lawyer from Fredericksburg, Virginia. At just 32 years old, Monroe was the youngest member of the First Senate. He had served in the Army in the Revolutionary War and then was a member of Virginia House of Delegates and the Continental Congress. But as you probably know, most of his career is still ahead of him at this point. And finally, Philemon Dickinson of New Jersey, who was specially elected to replace William Patterson, who had resigned on November 13th. Dickinson was a 51-year-old lawyer from Trenton, New Jersey, who was the younger brother of founding father John Dickinson. He was a major general during the Revolutionary War and afterwards served in the Continental Congress and on the New Jersey Legislative Council. On July 4th, 1778, there was a somewhat famous duel between Dickinson's cousin John Cadwallader and Thomas Conway. It was a direct result of the Conway Cabal, which is a really interesting story, but it's not really one for this channel, but you should go look it up. It's really good. Anyway, in this duel, Philemon Dickinson was his cousin's second. And that takes us to the end, March 3rd, 1791. Over the course of 2 years, the first Senate went from 22 to 26 seats, held by 29 senators. There was 1 death, 1 resignation, and 1 replacement. Senate seats are divided into 3 classes, which determines when they're up for election. This way, the 6-year terms overlap in such a way that only 1/3 of the seats are up for election in each election cycle. So, heading into the second Congress, 9 of the 26 seats were up for election. But before we get to the election results, let's have a proper farewell for the senators we lost along the way. William Grayson died March 12, 1790 at his home in Dumfries, Virginia. Presumably, he had been in poor health for some time as he never even attempted to join the second session of Congress. His son and grandson would go on to serve in Kentucky's state legislature, and his great-great-grandson would be the mayor of Chicago. But more relevant to this series, his nephew Alexander D. Orr would become a U.S. representative from Kentucky. John Walker had been the temporary replacement for Grayson and was himself replaced by the properly elected James Monroe. After Congress, Walker retired to private life as a planter and eventually died at his home near Madison Mills, Virginia on December 2, 1809. His brother, Francis Walker, would be elected to the House of Representatives in the next Congress. And William Patterson, who resigned on November 13, 1790. After Congress, he served as New Jersey's governor. It was that election that led to his resignation in the first place. And later, he resigned from that office after being appointed to the Supreme Court by President Washington. In 1803, Patterson was severely injured in a horse-drawn carriage accident and never fully recovered. Eventually, those injuries led to his death in Albany, New York on September 9, 1806. His grandson, Henry Bell Van Rensselaer, would go on to become a representative from New York. And now, the 1790-1791 election results. First, Oliver Ellsworth of Connecticut, George Reed of Delaware, Charles Carroll of Maryland, Theodore Foster of Rhode Island, and James Monroe of Virginia were all re-elected, so we'll see them again in the next episode. Philip Schuyler of New York lost his re-election. Coincidentally, he lost to Aaron Burr. But he would go on to win the seat back 6 years later, so we'll see him again in a few episodes. But for 3 senators, this was the end of the road. So let's say farewell to Tristram Dalton of Massachusetts, who lost so handily that when the election went to a 3rd runoff ballot, he had already been eliminated. After Congress, Dalton was the final commissioner of the federal city from 1801 to 1802 before the office was abolished and the new office of mayor of Washington, D.C. went into effect. Dalton loved the area, though, and engaged in heavy land speculation in the new city. It was a disaster. He lost pretty much everything. In his final years, he worked as the surveyor of the Port of Boston from 1814 until he died May 30th, 1817. William Maclay didn't really lose his election because there was no election held. For whatever reason, the Pennsylvania state legislature never elected a replacement. In fact, they didn't get around to doing so until February of 1793, over 2 years late and just 6 days before the end of the Second Congress. So that seat just stayed vacant the entire time. After Congress, Maclay served in the Pennsylvania House of Representatives from 1795 to 1797 and again in 1803. He was also a presidential elector in the 1796 election. Maclay died in Dauphin, Pennsylvania on April 16, 1804. His brother Samuel Maclay and his nephew William Maclay would both go on to be congressmen from Pennsylvania. And finally, Jonathan Elmer of New Jersey. He might have run for re-election, or he might not have. We don't know. The records are incomplete. What we do know is that when the Second Congress started, someone else was in this seat. After Congress, Elmer retired to private life until he was appointed to the Cumberland County Court of Common Pleas in 1802, where he stayed until 1804. He was appointed to the same post again in 1813, but declined due to poor health. He ultimately died in Bridgeton, New Jersey on September 3, 1817. His brother Ebenezer Elmer and his nephew Lucius Elmer would both go on to be representatives from New Jersey. But wait, there's one more. Senator William S. Johnson of Connecticut was not up for re-election, but he chose to resign when the first Congress ended on March 3, 1791. He was also the president of Columbia College and didn't want to keep leaving New York for Philadelphia. In 1800, he finally retired to private life in Connecticut, where he eventually died in Stratford on November 14th, 1819. So I guess I have to amend the numbers from before. There were 22 seats, then there were 26 seats, 29 senators altogether, 1 death, 1 replacement, and 2 resignations. There are so many more to come. And that was every member of the First Senate. 1 down, 117 to go. Now, go watch the episode about the House of Representatives. But before you do, don't forget to like, subscribe, leave a comment, etc., so forth. You know how all this works. Thank you so much for watching. I am the Congressman, and I will see you next time.